All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about punctuating quotes because, as you probably guessed, when we get to our next essay, to actually writing the body paragraphs of that essay, we're going to have a lot of quotation marks that are included in there. So, let's start with the most basic part, which I think we all know, but just to make sure, especially since y'all keep calling them parentheses, whenever you exactly quote the words of another person, so whether it's from a book or from, something someone said or a speech, it should be placed in quotation marks. So let's look at a couple examples. Maria said, "Let's go to that new taco place for lunch." On page 157, the author stated, "Pericles was the greatest and most influential of Athenian statesmen." Now, one extra thing to notice here, the first word of our quote is capitalized. So we capitalize Pericles, we capitalize let's, but we capitalize that first word. I want you to circle those capital letters as well so you remember that, okay? All right, now, let's look at our next part. Commas and periods that are part of the overall sentence. So, just your sentence in general that you're writing, not just your quotation marks, go inside the quotation marks, even though they weren't part of the original quote. Okay, so let's look at this correct example. The best investments today, comma, then our quotation marks, circle that, according to Smith, are commodities and emerging market stocks, period, inside the quotation marks. Circle that as well. All right, notice in the incorrect one, we have it on the outside. So you want yours to look like this correct one, not like the incorrect one. Okay, now there is an exception to this. When you're providing a page number, so like we'll be doing with Flowers of Algernon where we put a page number after our quote, the period will go after that page number. So our example, Charlie writes, "The tripling of intelligence by the surgical technique developed by Dr. Strauss and Niemer must be viewed as having little or no practical applicability to the increase of human intelligence." Quotation marks, page number, then period. So that's the only exception to this rule is when we're putting that set of page numbers after the quote, okay? Now, let's recap. Put quotation marks around our quote, capitalize the first letter of our quote, commas and periods go inside the quote, okay? Now, unless they are part of the original quotation, all punctuation marks other than a comma or a period are placed outside the quotation marks. So semicolons, exclamation points, question marks, all of that stuff goes outside the quotation marks unless it was in the original quotation. So let's look at a couple examples. Make it so I can scroll down. All right. She provides a thorough list of problems in her most recent article, "Misery in Paradise," semicolon, she doesn't provide a solution. So we put the semicolon outside the quotation, okay? It wasn't part of our original quote. It's just part of our sentence punctuation, so we put it outside the quotation marks. Now, you can see the incorrect example where we have it inside. Correct, wasn't it Dickens who wrote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times"? Circle that question mark. So that question mark goes outside your quotation marks, okay? It's not a part of the quote, all right? It's a part of your sentence. Your sentence is asking a question. All right, so that goes outside the quotation marks. All right, now, one of the things I know y'all are wondering what to do is how to introduce your quotes as you're actually writing. So how do you make this flow inside of your body paragraphs? Okay, so let's look at a couple ways you can do that. So let's go down here, introducing the quoted material. So the easiest way to do that is to add a little introductory phrase, a comma, and then put your quote, okay? So let's look at this example here. The flight attendant asked, "May I see your boarding pass?" Okay, now a couple things I want you to notice here. All right, circle your comma here. Okay, so when we do an introductory phrase like that, you want to put a comma after it, then your quotation marks. Okay, now notice our quote had a question mark in it, so that question mark goes inside the quotations. Okay, just to recap that little rule. Now, Buddha says, circle your comma, "Even death is not to be feared by one who has lived wisely." So we have our introductory phrase, Buddha says, comma, then our quote. On May 18th, Charlie states, comma, she just stared at me blankly and asked me what I meant about the mathematical variance equivalent in Doberman's fifth concerto. All right, so same thing, introductory phrase, telling you who said it, comma, quote. All right, now another way you can introduce this is with a colon. If you don't remember what a colon is, it's this little guy here, those two dots on top of each other, okay? And you usually use this when you're introducing a much longer quotation, or when instead of introducing it with a phrase, you introduce it with a sentence that could stand alone, okay? So in Food Rules, Michael Pollan summarizes his extensive writing about food with 7 words of advice. So underline that for me. That could stand alone as its own sentence. Okay, right? We don't need anything else there. It's its own sentence. All right, so then we put a colon. Then our quote, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. All right, let's look at this one. In his progress report, Charlie discusses the consequences for Algernon's brain. Let's underline that. Once again, this is something that could stand alone as its own sentence. So I put a colon, then I have this long quote. This section shows my predictions were right. His brain had decreased in weight, and there was a general smoothing out of cerebral convolutions, as well as a deepening and broadening of brain fissures. Now, so we've got introducing it with a comma when we start with the phrase. Introducing it with a colon, we've had a whole introductory sentence to introduce it, a sentence that could stand alone. Let's talk about when we'd have no punctuation to introduce it. So when the quoted material, the quote, is very short and just flows directly into our sentence, right? So there's no introduction of it, it just goes right in the sentence. We don't need any punctuation. So in our closing statement, the prosecutor spoke forcefully of the defendant's callous disregard for human life. Goes right in the sentence. It's very short. Okay, we don't need to punctuate it. Soon after Algernon's death, Charlie began to experience what he refers to as the burnout. Same thing, it's a quote, very short one, goes right in the sentence. The phrase, be that as it may, appears far too often in this essay. Same thing, very short, flows right into our sentence. We're not really introducing it, it's just part of the sentence, okay? Now, one last little situation is when you put the quote first, all right? So when the quote is listed first, you can change the punctuation at the end of the original quote to a comma. So say instead of saying Charlie writes, blah, 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 I want to say blah, 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 Charlie writes, okay? So let's look at an example. Algernon died 2 days ago. I want you to circle that comma, okay? That was originally just its own sentence. Algernon died 2 days ago. That was a sentence. But since I'm still going on with my sentence in my essay, I can just change that period to a comma so it all just flows together, okay? So let's recap our rules. Let's go back up to the top. All right. When you quote, you need to put quotation marks, okay? You need to capitalize the first letter of your quote, all right? If you have commas and periods that are part of your sentence, they go inside the quotation marks. Everything else goes outside unless it was part of the original quotation, like we saw in this one here. May I see your boarding pass, question mark. Otherwise, it's going to go outside the quotation marks, okay? When we are putting our quotes inside our essays, there's a couple ways we can introduce them. We can do a little short introductory phrase, Charlie states, and then a comma. We can do a whole sentence explaining what's about to happen in our quote, and then do a colon, okay? We can just put a tiny snippet of our quote inside a bigger sentence with no punctuation, like we saw here, okay? Or we can put our quote first and then explain who said it, like we saw here. Okay? So we're going to practice this tomorrow. I'm going to work with y'all a lot as you put these quotes in your essay so you know exactly how to do it. And let me know if you have any questions.